Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill. I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at AAVMC. I am delighted to be back doing shows in 2021, taking a very long break. 2020 was a very busy year for the show. I was doing shows almost weekly there for a while, producing a lot of content in response to the social uprisings really kind of triggered by the death of George Floyd. So again, I ended up taking an extended break, but we're back with new shows. And today is our first show, live show of 2021. And I am delighted to welcome Dr. Daniella Dos Santos to the show to discuss diversity efforts in veterinary medicine and how they're shaping up in the United Kingdom. So much of the discourse around diversity kind of centers the US experience working on social justice issues. But the reality is these are issues globally. The lack of diversity is not unique to the US. Issues around kind of the gender imbalance, that's also a global issue. It's all not just centered in the US. So the British also struggle with the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in veterinary medicine. And so our chat today will explore efforts to widen participation in the profession. Daniella, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, so why don't we start as our custom on the show, guest self-introduce and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. So as you said, my name is Daniella Dos Santos, and I am currently the Senior Vice President of the British Veterinary Association. I'm also a small animal and exotic pet vet in practice. And during my time as a BVA officer, my theme, my focus, my efforts have all been around vet diversity. So championing the diversity of people, as well as the diversity of careers we undertake. So that has been my real push over the last 3 years. When it comes to my background, obviously I am white, but actually I'm not your typical veterinary background. So my parents are immigrants. My mother was a cleaner, my father was a chef. Lower socioeconomic background, inner city kid, no history of science in my background, no one that had gone to university before me. And it took me 5 attempts to get into vet school. And even though I am female and white, I got to vet school and I realized I don't quite fit in. And if I didn't quite fit in, there would be others feeling exactly the same as me for various different reasons. And yeah, it's such a wonderful profession. I've kind of made it my mission to try and widen access, inclusion as well, because there's a difference between widening access and inclusion. And so, yeah, that's been my mission over the last 3 years, and I am delighted to be here talking about it.
Wonderful. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. Before we started kind of in our pre-production chat, we were chatting about your Portuguese background. I have been trying to learn Portuguese for years, so I will be chatting with you again after the show. Like, can I send you some of my C-Spot run in Portuguese emails so that you can help me with my development? So anyway, back to our topic at hand. So what does widening participation actually mean? Because it's a different kind of language. Of course it's English, but a different kind of lexicon that is being used in the UK that maybe some of our non-UK members and listeners are not necessarily familiar with. So what does widening participation really mean?
Yeah, so when we talk about widening participation, we are talking about increasing the diversity and the backgrounds of people that enter our profession. So, when you look at some of the data, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons collects demographic data every 5 years or so about our profession. And we're very predominantly white and we are disproportionately privately educated. And so there's lots of trends, if that makes sense, sort of stereotypes associated with being a vet in the UK. And so the idea behind widening participation is to actually open up that horizon, to encourage those from those and I'm going to say traditional, but I don't mean that. I should probably say stereotypical backgrounds, those non-stereotypical backgrounds. 5 years or so about our profession, and we're very predominantly white and we are disproportionately privately educated, and so there's lots of trends, if that makes sense, or stereotypes. Because I'm hearing myself back.
Yes, sorry about that. Like it's the live stream started kind of playing there spontaneously, and I was trying to figure out how to turn it off.
So widening participation is essentially looking at the stereotypical demographic of a veterinary surgeon in the UK and trying to rubbish that, trying to say, actually, this is not the way it should be, and trying to encourage those from other backgrounds to consider a career as a veterinary surgeon or veterinary nurse, just a career within the veterinary professions. And I think that's really, really important. And so that's what we talk about, widening participation, widening access. It's encouraging people to consider it, because we're in a situation that people are not even considering a career as a veterinary professional for various factors, which I'm sure we will delve into as time goes on.
Sure. So kind of when, what's a bit of the history around this effort? Like how long has like BVA really been kind of working on this kind of from a national perspective?
Yeah, so I think it's probably safe to say for a few years now, it has been something that the vet schools have been trying to do. You know, the vet schools have their own outreach programs and so on. So it's always been in the background. You know, there's been access programs, year zero programs or gateway programs. But actually the national conversation around this, I would say, is actually quite recent. So up until I took post about 2.5 years ago, this was not a conversation we were having widely. You know, the issue of discrimination, of access and so on, it just wasn't a conversation that was being widely had. And since I've been at the BVA, we did our groundbreaking discrimination in the veterinary profession survey, which was phenomenally well responded to. Mm-hmm. We have done lots of work around the good workplace. We have had a widening participation workshop as well. We're working with the Royal College in their diversity and inclusion group. So actually, I would say in the last 3 years, there's been a concerted effort from various different stakeholders, sure. Vet schools, us, the Royal College, and the wider profession. And yeah, we're now having these conversations and trying to figure out a way forward.
Sure. So what groups, I guess, are included here, right? And so, you know, to kind of just compare things in the US, we have our definition at AVMC for underrepresented in veterinary medicine, and it covers a number of different areas. So we talk about gender, we talk about race and ethnicity, we talk about kind of educational background and socioeconomic status, and also kind of geography as well, because we have, you know, economically depressed really areas that it's just hard for students of any race or gender to kind of, you know, make it out of those kind of regions, right? And so so that's kind of the framework that we kind of think about here. But what is the framework similar? I also recognize that we use different language, different things like the BAME. Is that how it's pronounced? Yeah. And so if you could talk a little bit about that and kind of who's included in the current view of trying to bring them in.
Sure. So I think couple of things. I think framework should be used very loosely when we're talking about this at the moment, okay? Because there is at the moment, no organized, you know, national multi-collaborative approach to this at the moment. There's recognition that we need to do more. And I think if we look at how things are being assessed, what factors we're looking at. So I think the socioeconomic background is a big factor here that is being looked at. Certainly a lot of the widening participation programs from the schools take into account the postcode in which a child has grown up and been educated, because that looks at areas of deprivation and things like that. It also looks at educational background, so what schools you've been to as well. More recently, because of the uprisings last year, because of the rightly the light being shone on the issues around race, that has also come up the agenda in terms of the conversations we're having. And there is also conversations around geography. So for example, in Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, these are very remote islands where children may not have access to all the classes that they need to get into vet school and so on. So there is a wide-reaching sort of look on this subject. What do we need to do here? And actually, when it comes to gender, I think that's also an interesting one. So when we start talking about things like socioeconomic background, race, geography, educational background, when we come to gender, we are a disproportionately female profession, certainly in the UK, and increasingly more so. You know, our student population now is about 80% female. And it's interesting when we start having conversations about gender, often it's where are the boys? And actually, it's the perfect place to start for me to talk about intersectionality, because I actually don't think it helps anybody to try and look at all these identifying features, characteristics, whatever, demographics, whatever you want to call them. It helps no one to look at them in isolation, because we're therefore assuming that all women face the same barriers, or all inner city kids face the same barriers, or all people of color face the same barriers. And that's not how it goes. There are compounding factors, there are factors that interlink. And so, you know, there are some efforts out there around, for example, bursaries for BAME students and things like that, which are great. But longer term, we need to look at the intersectionality of this. If we truly want to widen participation to reflect the society that we as professionals serve, we need to look wider at this. And I often give this as an example. So in the medical profession in the UK, for example, they have done really well in their ethnic diversity. And so they've got a really ethnically diverse medical profession. However, if you look at their socioeconomic demographics, 80% of doctors come from 20% of schools. So you can see, exactly. So you can see if you focus too much on one aspect, you can end up with other imbalances. Sure. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Oh yeah, the intersectionality piece is just so interesting, because yeah, we spend I think globally we spend a lot of time going, where are the men, where are the men, where are the men, right? And certainly I've given a number of talks about, you know, kind of what's happening in kind of pre-college, you know, primary and secondary education, and kind of thinking about, like, yeah, they're not just, at least in the US, young men are not finishing high school at the same rates, right? And so, you know, the drop off only just, you know, just continues from there. But when we start looking at, you know, the gender imbalance and issues around race and issues around socioeconomic status, you know, we have, you know, yeah, there might be more women of color, but is it proportional? Not even close, right? Not even close. And so there's still things that we need to talk about with respect to that. The other thing is that, you know, the piece around gender is we're so focused on talking about students that a lot of times we don't talk about kind of what happens post degree, right? And just kind of the ascension to leadership. For women, and women tend to ascend to leadership at much later rates than their male counterparts, in part because we're doing other things like kids and families and managing households, in addition to, you know, whatever professions we're doing. And so, you know, we wake up and we're like, oh, I'm 45. Like, I think I can actually do some volunteer work now, right? And so it's, you know, these are just long stem challenges that affect folks at very different stages of life. So really, really something to be mindful of. So Daniella, tell us about, you know, well, what is BVA doing? And so let's start with kind of maybe recruitment efforts. So what's happening there?
So we are at the beginning of what I hope is putting some foundations in place to, as you say, we're at the end of this very long stem, and, you know, any change is going to take a decade easily, because the evidence we have is that we need to be encouraging children, young children, to think about a career in the veterinary professions, and then nurturing them through. And it's not simple as an individual touch point. So there are various things we're doing. So as BVA, we have done various things. So for example, I was a STEM ambassador for British Science Week. I'm doing lots of outreach programs, sort of like that, saying, hello, hi, I'm here, 5 attempts, inner city kids, you can do it too. You don't have to look a certain way. I'm championing my diversity theme and so on, as I've already said. We did our discrimination survey, which, as you've just touched on the gender thing, is actually interesting. The discrimination survey demonstrated that discrimination was more prevalent if you were a woman, and also based on your race, which was, considering how white we are, that to be the second most common discrimination was interesting. So basically, we've done this collating of data as well. So the discrimination survey, the good workplace survey, we're collating data about where are the problems, what are the challenges. We did our widening participation workshop, trying to learn from our medical counterparts, because you know, there is no point repeating the same mistakes. We should learn from other professions, and it's naive to think that just because we're vets we're different. We're not. We face the same social challenges as everybody else in society. And so now as I said, I sit on the Royal College's Diversity and Inclusion Group, so that has just published the strategy looking at widening participation as well as inclusion within the profession. We're currently at BVA working with STEM learning, so we're looking to develop a resource to try and get out there into schools. We're not entirely sure what it will look like at this stage. We'll be working closely with educators because ultimately we need their expertise. I'm not an educator, we are not educators, we don't understand how this works. So we're going to work with them to try and discover what best resources there are. So that's the starting point, a couple of bits and pieces here. I would love in the long term to end up with a national program that includes work experience, that includes access to role models and so on. But that needs collaboration and funding. And I think a challenge, and I don't know if you feel like that about the States as well, is actually bringing people together, to work together, to not be protective of their own work, because we're not going to get there if we all act in silos. We're not going to get there if we all act individually. So at the moment, like I say, outreach program, pushing this conversation. I take part in the National Health Careers Conference, which is the biggest widening participation conference for healthcare in the UK. It's free for students to attend, and with our involvement, there's been a 600% increase in children attending that are interested in a career in the veterinary profession. So we're doing lots of bits and pieces, but it's just the beginning. We need long-term funding and collaboration. This is not going to change without it.
Yeah, that's just so important. And I think that it's I guess a couple of notes. One, yes, it's absolutely important for us to remember that just because women kind of take up the most space, I guess, in the profession does not mean that they are free from harassment or from marginalization, right? So that's one thing I think is really, really important to highlight in your comment. And the other thing, and this is a drum I beat on a regular basis, do not recreate the wheel, people. There's research out there, and stop saying, yeah, but it's not published in a veterinary journal. Yes, it's not, because you never did it before. But look, there's 50 years of research in other disciplines.
Do you know what's also really, really interesting? So in the UK, there is a longitudinal study called the Aspire study that's looked at kids, from a really young age. I think they're now in their early 20s now, same kids, same families, and has looked at their interest in STEM subjects. The barriers are there, clearly written down in their research. It tells you what we need to do. It talks about how it's linked to social inequalities and social injustices. It talks about how we need to increase science capital. It talks about the fact that outreach programs have a marginal effect, because this is about the environment in which children grow up in. And sometimes that's a difficult pill to swallow, because we as a profession but we went out into the local school and we did this and we did that. That is all great. But that is not going to make the long-term difference. So we do need to listen to the evidence that says we need funding, that says we need collaborative efforts, that says we need a longitudinal effort as well, if we're going to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I am absolutely supportive, and certainly encourage folks to go to the career days and, the show and tells and all of that. And I think exposure is so critical. However, one, I also want to, and I say this a lot too, don't assume that Black, brown, poor, immigrant, whatever, kids don't dream. They do. There are gates.
But that is what the Aspires show. There is no lack of aspiration or interest or anything like that. And I don't fully understand the educational system in the US, but certainly what we're finding here is that actually, probably for decent long-term significant change, you need changes in educational policy. It's highlighted that we have educational gatekeeping in our education system. If you're not super smart, super brainy, over you go there. Don't bother with the science. It's not for you. Certain areas of the country, teachers will actively say, I don't think veterinary medicine's for you. If you have a high turnover of teacher or poor quality teaching in a school, they're less likely to go for it. We perpetuate this elitist system where we say it's so difficult to become a vet. Is it? You just need the support behind you, don't you? You need the educational support behind you. You need the societal support behind you, and you can make it. But like you say, if there are gates and barriers and deviations on your way, it makes it so much harder.
Right, it does. And you know, our collective response has historically been to pathologize those folks like, oh, well, either they're not interested because they haven't had exposure. And I'm like, no, they dream. Or, you know, they just don't want to do this. They found something else. And I'm like, no, there were just, you know, you scale one barrier and then there's like 5 more, right?
Absolutely.
So it just makes it really challenging for students coming from challenging places to achieve, right? And so okay, so Daniella, you all have done all of this great stuff, and in a few years you're going to see like this wonderful burgeoning applicant pool to vet schools in the UK. Like, we're just gonna like ignore the facial expressions, like, really, are we going to do that?
We are definitely going to do it.
We are definitely going to do that. And so, you know, then, you know, you mentioned that you were serving with a group at the Royal College, Royal Veterinary College in London. So, you know, what's going on with, you know, the colleges? And I know a lot of the colleges in the UK are working on these issues as well, working on widening participation. But what we're finding is that, you know, yeah, that's one chunk.
Exactly.
And we are another gatekeeper, right? Admissions committees are another gatekeeper. So what are we talking about and thinking about in the UK around admissions?
Yeah, so just for the listeners who are not familiar with the UK system, so the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons are essentially our regulator. So in terms of you, I think in the States you have different regulators in different states. We have an overarching regulator, which is the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. They are also a Royal College, but they are the ones that, you know, will maintain educational standards and so on. And then we have the veterinary schools. So I think our terminology is slightly different.
RVC.
RVC and RCVS. So RCVS, we park, that's our regulator. RVC, for example, is one of the vet schools, so we call them schools. And we have various schools in the UK. And each individual school deserves credit because they are really, really working hard to widen participation. And they are doing things such as contextual admissions, which I only recently understood the word contextual. You go to a 16-year-old and go, don't worry, you can get into vet school because there's a contextual admission service. They just look at you and go, what?
What's that?
So there's a thing about language here, but they are doing things like taking into account, you know, the area in which you grew up, you know, because certainly in the UK, the schools at which you go to have a real impact on the likelihood of you getting decent grades and so on. So they're taking into account that. The RVC, for example, has a really good gateway program. So it's an access program to allow students from disadvantaged or non-traditional backgrounds to come in. So there are concerted efforts. Each school is different. There will be differences in grade requirements. Often the grade requirements are dropped. We can have a conversation about dropped grade requirements because I think that's an interesting factor. But why they do it is because they take into account not every child has the same opportunity or the same educational chances, and so they take into account that perhaps a child from a school with high turnover of teachers and a poor history, if they come out with 4 Bs, actually that's absolutely incredible. And so they're taking that contextual offers. So they're doing things like that. They have some of them are not looking at predicted grades anymore. So we know, so in the UK, you will get a predicted grade before you sit your exams. And those predicted grades are often inaccurate. They are full of biases as well. You know, it depends what schools you go to and things like that. So there are some universities now who are not looking at predicted grades. There are others that are not using teacher statements either, because if you think about it, if you're in a well-funded school, your teacher statements, and this is, and I'm not casting aspersions on teachers, I just want to be clear here, but if you are a teacher in an underfunded school, your workload is enormous. You have so many challenges to face, the social impacts on your students, all sorts of stuff. So if you have a child that goes to a well-funded school with a teacher who has all the support they need, that teacher will be able to provide the support and the statement. A teacher working unbelievably hard in a deprived area just won't have that support and time to be able to give to that student. So no aspersions on teachers, it's just the reality of society.
It's just the reality. Yeah.
And so they're doing things like that. They also have student outreach programs. So there's a group of students at the RVC called Animal Aspirations. I love them. I think they are absolutely amazing, truly inspirational group of students. They are going out, doing the role modeling, that, you know, we need to do. You can't be what you can't see. And those guys are going out and going, you can be this, look, this is amazing. So we're doing things like that. There are membership bodies as well that are playing parts here. So I think the schools are doing really good work, but they're limited by geography, because often their outreach is just around where they are.
Yeah.
They're limited by kids that are already showing an interest. So you're still missing all those other kids that society has told, no, you can't be a vet for whatever reasons society decides to say that.
Yeah. I mean, we're always just fighting that battle of, you know, this is also I think that we've all seen over the years is that it's only really been in more recent years that the profession has had to recruit. Right. And so, because there was always, you know, this plethora of folks that were just like, oh, I was born and I knew I wanted to be a veterinarian. Right. And now there are just so many. I mean, you know, we're beyond just the industrial age. We're almost beyond the tech age, where everything is just so different. And there's so many careers that didn't exist 5 years ago. Right. And so the competition for kind of career choice is tough. And yet we still know, though, that the majority of applicants to veterinary school express an interest before the age of 10, right? I mean, so you got to catch them young, and you got to keep, you know, following them to sustain the interest and provide the support, you know, to scale the gates.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Aspires research project calls that science capital. So it talks about, you know, it's what exposure do you have in your day-to-day life to science? So you might have, and which is why we have to realize that outreach programs and these really brilliant, you know, me doing a STEM talk or someone going out in schools is great at the time, but you go in, you inspire that kid, and then off you go. And then they're left in a system where the teachers go, no, vet school is far, far too difficult to go into. Why don't you think about this? A family who might go, oh, no, that's really, really difficult. No access to books, no access to even the internet, for example, no access to role models, no access to anyone to talk to. So it's about sustained, as you say, points of contact, support all the way through. But it's really important. We've touched on it a couple of times. We can recruit diverse people into our profession. We can work hard to do that. But unless we also focus on inclusion, making people feel valued, seeing people's worth, making them welcome into the profession, I would question morally whether we should be doing that, because you don't want to bring diverse people into a profession to then make them feel like they don't belong.
Right. It's a profession where, you know, they have the emotional labor of just doing the work, and then emotional labor of being in a potentially hostile environment, which this is a great segue to talk about the workplace campaign, Good Workplaces. So if you could talk a little bit about that, which really gets into kind of the inclusion efforts, which I think a lot of folks don't spend enough time talking about, that need to go hand in hand.
Yeah, and absolutely, they do need to go hand in hand. I would argue morally, if they don't go hand in hand, we should not be widening participation. But let's talk about inclusion. So we in the UK have had a recruitment and retention problem for many, many years. And it comes back to evidence. For many years, there was anecdote. This is why it's happening. That's why it's happening. And actually, BVA took it upon themselves to go, actually, if we want to find a solution, we need to identify the problem. We need to identify why this is happening. And so we undertook various pieces of research with the University of Exeter. So first of all, we did a piece looking at motivation, satisfaction, and retention. So why is it that people stay or leave the profession? Interestingly, the highlights were things around feeling like you fit in, feeling like you're valued, feeling like you have role models, that you know, people can look up to you. Pay, which is often brought up, was a hygiene factor. Pay is a hygiene factor here. It is about how you fit in, how you are valued. And so that came up very strongly, that that's why people stay or leave. Now, there are various reasons why you feel like you fit in or you don't, or you're valued or you don't. And we could dig into those, but ultimately that was that issue there. But interestingly, in the middle of it appeared this gender discrimination. And so we picked up, we said, okay, so someone is saying that gender discrimination means they're more likely to leave someone who's a group of people. And so we did a second study on that, and we looked at gender discrimination in the profession. And what we did was we surveyed about 260 managers or practice owners, basically people in charge of recruitment.
Okay.
We provided them with a CV and a worksheet of a vet. And we blindly gave them one or the other. The only differences was one was Mark, one was Elizabeth. right? And we asked them to rate these vets in terms of competence, how much they would pay them, would they encourage them to go for promotion, how much would they see them as, being a good source of information. As a separate question, we asked them, do you still think gender discrimination exists in the profession? Now, what we found was that there was gender discrimination. So Mark was seen as more competent, would be paid significantly more, would be pushed for more promotions, etc., would be seen as a more valuable point of advice for colleagues. But that was far more likely when an individual felt gender discrimination was not a problem. So it's the unconscious bias. I mean, you're nodding your head. You knew this was going to happen. But again, there's this feeling that there's some reason that the profession thinks we're different to society. Of course we're not. We don't live in an isolated bubble. So there we had it. We had evidence of where the problem was. And actually, it was that gender discrimination piece that I looked at and I said, but if gender discrimination is such a factor, there will be other forms of discrimination. That's why we did our discrimination survey. And actually, we came up with some flack by skeptics. Our first one was very much please tell us. It was an open book. We weren't trying to establish how prevalent it was or anything like that. And there were people saying, oh, well, you can't use this data because you didn't give me an option to say I'd never experienced discrimination. So then we did a second survey with that option. Interestingly, the results were exactly the same. Exactly the same. So then we used all of this data. I know. We use all of this data and we've put together the BVA's Good Workplaces guide. And it's a voluntary code and it's got, I think, seven chapters in it that looks at different aspects of what makes a good workplace. It talks about culture. It talks about equality, diversity and inclusion, pay and hours, remuneration, all sorts of different things. There's a whole chapter about diversity and inclusion, which comes to that saying that I've heard repeatedly. You can invite everyone to the party, but you've got to make sure everyone dances as well.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole chapter on that, trying to help people who perhaps want to make their workplace a more inclusive place, but have no idea how to start. It gives them the option there. It also helps people reflect, am I really as inclusive as I think I am?
Yeah. I mean, it's the findings are not surprising to me. They are consistent with similar studies across not just veterinary medicine. Like that's a very common finding in that type of study across workspaces, right? And so that, it's like, oh no, I'm objective. No, I am objective. Yep. And Mark is still the better candidate. And that's fine. There are some folks that will genuinely think that. But again, when we kind of look across these data, in total, there's a very clear pattern. When we look at salary comparisons, there's almost always a very clear pattern. And, and then again, even though we see that women are making up such a huge proportion of the profession, does not mean that they're immune to marginalization. And so I think it's really important. And if it can happen to the biggest group, just to think about what might be happening for groups that are really underrepresented and are otherwise marginalized.
But that's what the discrimination survey showed us. I think it was in second place, off the top of my head, I think it's about 23% of reported instances of discrimination were related to race, when less than 3% of the profession identify as being from a BAME background. That's huge. And there's an interesting theme, I think, between the data of inclusion, but also the data of widening participation, as in what works, what doesn't, why we have the problem, is data makes people uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable to think that actually we're not in a just or fair society, or that perhaps their own unconscious bias is playing a part in this. And so we have to accept that the data makes us uncomfortable. We can't change anything unless we listen to the data. And as scientists, we talk about evidence-based medicine. Why is it any different when you are presented with data about us as people, as opposed to, I don't know, cruciate disease in a dog or mastitis in cattle? Why are we not accepting data as data?
You are, yes. Yes, because I mean, we see these things, these research papers and these reports and things, and and they tell us things that make us not feel that great about the collective, right? And so then folks kind of attack the methodology and they're like, oh
Yes.
yeah, but was the decimal point here? And does that really, or is there false positives? Or
the best one I heard was when I was having this kind of difficult conversation about barriers to access, so widening participation and so on, and I pushed someone to go and read the Aspire study because it's a brilliant study, it's scientifically sound, and all they came back to me with was ignoring all the data, saying, well, in the introduction they talk about social justice, so of course it's already biased from the outset. And I was like, but actually it's not. Just have a read. It's very accurate, and this is the only way we're going to change things. But there we go.
Yeah, it's just there are times when I feel like I'm like, skip to page 3. Like, just start reading there. Start reading at page 3. So with all of these things, one of the things that you mentioned was a major increase in kind of enrollment in these STEM programs as one certainly element of success. What other things have you felt like in this kind of short, high intensity period have worked or, really seem to have a great impact?
So I think there are a few things that have worked. So I've already talked about animal aspirations. So student-led role modeling is brilliant at the moment. Animal aspirations has now expanded into other universities as well, having started at the RVC. So that is amazing. We're also talking about this. We weren't talking about this 3, 4, 5 years ago. So we're talking about this. We're formalizing the conversation. I led up this hashtag big conversation where I spoke off the back of the discrimination survey. I spoke to BVEDS, the British Veterinary Ethnicity and Diversity Society, talking candidly and openly about the challenges there. BV LGBT+, so looking at those from the LGBT+ community, talking about their challenges, even with veterinary spoonholders, who are a support group for those with chronic illnesses and disabilities. So we are formalizing this conversation. We are having a conversation that we were not having before. And whilst it's a small step, I think it's a really important step, because it's you can't hide from a conversation that's being had openly, even if the conversation makes you uncomfortable. So that was good. We've done membership organizations have also done showcasing role modeling. So when I became president of the BVA, we had a spread in our journal about different vets from different backgrounds with different experiences. We all looked completely different, just a role model. BV LGBT+ do that as well. BVEDs are also doing it. The university sectors are taking this very seriously now. So the vet schools are taking this seriously, which is really, really important as well. And with their outreach programs. And we've already touched on some of the admissions things around, not using predicted grades and peers support and teacher statements and so on. So there are lots of small things, and I do not want to dismiss them, because I think they're all brilliant and they weren't happening a few years ago, but it is not enough.
Yeah. So what's, in terms of that it's not enough, what have you found to be the most challenging in kind of launching this effort? Because it is a relatively new effort, and there's always going to be some resistance.
So originally,
like, I'm okay. Like, why aren't you okay?
Yeah. So originally, it was that one of them was you can't be what you can't see. But actually, I think as a veterinary profession, we have got more and more role models coming forward. I have to say that we have to be slightly careful that we don't pin the whole hopes of a demographic on a small number of people. That we don't assume that all women are like me, for example, in leadership positions. That we don't assume all people that identify as being from a BAME background have the same feelings, thoughts, processes, challenges, barriers, but we do have more role models. Challenge is bringing the profession with us. That is a huge, huge challenge. There are still skeptics, accusations of identity politics, people not seeing the value of having a diverse profession. And, the starting point is diversity is a good thing, end of story. I do not understand why this is still a discussion, but there's that issue. Language is important as well, because we need to consider, contextual. 15, 16-year-old doesn't know what contextual means. Also influencing the influencers. So we need to take into account when we look at, as we've touched on, teachers, family members, earlier on in children's careers. One of the biggest problem in my opinion, however, funding, and collaboration. So I'm going to be slightly controversial that it looks good to be interested in certain subjects, and it's very good to say we're working on X, Y, or Z. And it's great to have individual projects and put them up as a sign of success. But long-term success only happens if all organizations work together and if people put money into their pockets. We cannot expect to change the expectations and the dreams and the opportunities of a generation with no funding and no collaborative effort. So I guess that is my bottom line. There are plenty of us out there who are willing to do this work, but it needs to be funded, and organizations need to work together in order to make this happen.
Yes.
Thanks.
Increase those budgets, people, open those wallets, and yeah, like you have to fund these things. And, you know, I think that this is also a big challenge, because I think that there's a lot of folks who, you know, there are a lot. I'm so happy to see so many veterinary organizations here and abroad that are really, really interested in doing, you know, this kind of work and really kind of thinking critically about the future of the profession. Because it's not just like here and now, but this is really kind of looking out to the profession 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and kind of, you know, thinking about what the surrounding demographics are and how we're going to meet the needs of a changing society. And, you know, that just doesn't happen on, you know, a quid. Right? It just doesn't.
It also doesn't happen on goodwill. It just won't happen on goodwill.
Yeah.
How can we ever reach the children in far-flung geographical places? How can we ever reach the children in deprived areas? How can we ever reach children from a BAME background, or the travelling community, for example, in the UK as well? How can we ever reach them on goodwill alone, when we know that the evidence says they need sustained support to get over the educational and social inequalities that prevent them from being able to enter our profession? You cannot do that without funding, and you cannot do that without collaboration and a long-term effort.
Yeah, I mean, if we're willing to invest in, you know, being technologically ready for the next generation, we need to be investing time, money, talents, and money, time, talents, you know, in making sure that we have the workforce to actually use that stuff, right? And so, funding typically is a big challenge for everyone. And you know, I often tell people that, you know, we pay for what's important, and we spend money on things that we find deeply important and resonating. And so, if you say that you're committed to this, if you say that it's a core value, then your budget should actually reflect that.
And how is there anything that's more valuable than people? And I don't say that as a throwaway comment. I genuinely, you know, all the businesses you have out there, the educational establishments, everything is based around people. We should be willing to fund this. We should be willing to help people, to support people in coming into the profession, because without doubt, diversity is a good thing. It's beneficial for everyone, for individuals, for businesses, for societies, and for animal health and welfare. You know, if a marginalized community doesn't trust the veterinary profession, but they see someone just like them who understands the way they think, the way they live, you know, why they put a certain value on certain animals, they are more likely to access veterinary health care. They're more likely to trust what we say. So yeah, anyway, I'll get off my high horse now.
No, we like high horses on this show. That's what this show is committed to, high horses. No, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. So, you know, I know that BVA is on social media. Can you tell folks where they can find more about BVA and what you all are doing?
Yep, so obviously our website, bva.co.uk, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, British Vets, you'll find us there. Hashtag Time for Change, hashtag Vet Diversity, hashtag VConversation. They're all the places that you can find us. And if you are in the States and want to find out more, want to let me know about your experiences, any good learnings, any things that we could learn from, please reach out. Otherwise, if you're in the UK and you want to have more conversations, please also reach out. we can only do this together. We can only do this with a collaborative and concerted effort. This is so much more than just you or I or individual organisations. It needs whole-scale change. It needs the profession to come with us.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Dos Santos, for joining me this morning or afternoon for you. And I look forward to having more of these kinds of conversations. There is so much going on over there. Yes, with Animal Aspirations, I'm interested in having this kind of chat with them. And of course, we are not going to get into it on this show, but then there's this like gigantic recent report that just came out that says institutional racism is just apparently not a thing there. And so, yeah, I'll be having another show to kind of definitely dig into that at some point, because I think it's a fascinating report, and probably one that will have spillover into other countries as well, saying, see, they don't have a problem. We probably don't have a problem either, right? So thank you so much again. This has been another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app and like us on Facebook. Thanks so much, and we will hear you and listen to you and see you next time. Bye-bye.